All right. Peace and power, everybody, as we filter in from the waiting room into the classroom. For those of you who are in this space for the first time, as much as possible, so first of all, if you're in the space for the first time, welcome in. If you're in the space after multiple visits, welcome back. You guys that have been here before know that I start every class at 11 minutes past the hour. So usually this will be a time when we've got some poetry or some educational content as people filter into the room. What I'm going to do right now is put on an 8-minute long video that does an excellent job encapsulating some of the foundational intellectual influences and a kind of historical narrative of the life of Frantz Fanon. It's going to be great viewing for us to revisit over the next couple of days. And you can be listening to it and watching it while you grab your coffee. I'm prepping my tea right here. And we are going to start the conversation at 11 minutes past the hour. Thank you for sharing your Saturday with me. And I'm going to share screen now so we can get rolling.
When we revolt, it is not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. Maman, see the Negro. I'm frightened, frightened, frightened. Now they were beginning to be afraid of me. I made up my mind to laugh myself to tears. But laughter had become impossible. I could no longer laugh because I already knew that there were legends, stories, history.
This is the scene described by Frantz Fanon, and this was the moment that led him to become one of the most influential anti-colonial thinkers of the last century.
On that day, completely dislocated, unable to be abroad with the other, the white man who unmercifully imprisoned me, I took myself far off from my own presence, far indeed, and made myself an object.
Fanon, writer, psychiatrist, political philosopher, one of the first thinkers to expose racism as a mental sickness and describe the effects of colonialism on the psyche.
The individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. From this point on, the real values of the occupied quickly tend to acquire a clandestine form of existence.
Fanon is born in 1925 in the French colony of Martinique. He goes to fight alongside the Allied forces against Nazi Germany. After the war, he goes to study psychiatry in France. There, he writes Black Skin, White Masks. He chronicles the psychology of trauma from the perspective of a black man. He speaks of a neurosis of blackness based on the racial epidermal schema, which exposes the dream of turning white. He knows this. He has lived it.
All this whiteness that burns me. I sat down at the fire and became aware of my uniform. I had not seen it. It is indeed ugly. I stopped there, for who can tell me what beauty is?
These are the 50s. France is a magnet for black intellectuals, a hothouse of radical thought. But Fanon also wants revolutionary action. He goes to Algeria, gets a job as director of psychiatry at the Blida Hospital in Algiers, sees firsthand the effects of French settler colonialism, poverty, oppression, violence.
The colonized sector is a disreputable place, inhabited by disreputable people. You're born anywhere. anyhow. You die anywhere from anything. It's a world with no space. People are piled one on top of the other. The shacks squeezed tightly together.
It's the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence. He's there in 1955 for the Philippeville Uprising, a turning point. The French think they have encircled Algeria's insurgents. They are wrong. Algeria's revolutionary army, the National Liberation Front, breaks the siege for the first time, targeting civilians. 123 colonial settlers massacred. France, humiliated, sought revenge, escalated its war machine, killed more than 10,000 Algerians. A bloody, all-out war ensued. Fanon, he took a side, left his job, joined the FLN, trained nurses, wrote in support of the struggle across Africa, edited the FLN's newspaper El Mujahid.
Ours is a national struggle to destroy an anarchic colonial regime. It is not a religious war. It represents a march forward in the historical path of human progress.
The war claimed hundreds of thousands of Algerians' lives. More than 2 million were displaced. But it was a war France did not win. In 1962, Algeria had fought and had won its independence. Frantz Fanon did not live to see that day. He died of leukemia just 4 months before. Yet, his work became an inspiration for anti-colonial thinkers and for the armed struggle across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East and beyond.
Liberation does not come as a gift from anybody. It is seized by the masses with their own hands. And by seizing it, they themselves are transformed. Confidence in their own strength soars, and they turn their energy and their experience to the tasks of building, governing, and deciding their own lives for themselves.
Still 2 minutes to go before our official beginning, but how incredibly super dope is that as an introduction to Fanon and his biographical narrative, and what he stood on and stood for. While we're kind of welcoming folks in, there's actually a recently produced French film released in 2024 about Fanon's life. I have not yet been able to get my hands on a copy. I'm going to try to see if I can get my hands on a copy, so that we can hold some kind of watch party for that Fanon film, because the reporting on it that I've heard is that it's excellent. The reviews say that it's quite excellent. So that might be a collective homework assignment that if I can get my hands on it fast enough, maybe that's our Saturday night watch party. And if it's if it takes a little longer, then maybe that's where we'll have a class reunion for a watch party. But there's finally, some excellent work being done to draw Frantz Fanon's life and legacy into public discourse. And with that, as we hit 11:11, let me officially begin our session. Um, I'll start this way. For those of you who, I'm looking at a few faces on the screen. I'm looking at Morella, I'm looking at Christina, I'm looking at some people that are here for maybe the 30th or 40th or 50th time in this online teaching space. I started doing online spiritual intensives rooted in the Islamic revolutionary tradition in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And many people have been in that space. It was mostly just Muslims talking to one another at that point in time. When I got pulled into electoral politics, the circle started getting wider and wider. So whether this is your first time or your 50th time, I'm deeply grateful that you've chosen to spend a Saturday talking through revolutionary psychology with me. It's a humbling experience. In this space, we try to approach it with a spirit of generosity. So that means like listening with a generous ear, engaging the people that are present, whether in the chat or when we go to Q&A, with as much generosity of spirit as possible. So please try to bring that ethic to the space. Also, um, I see a lot of cameras on, which is fantastic. We always ask people as much as possible to keep their cameras on just so that we can create that classroom environment, that feeling of mutual accountability that comes with eye contact, even through a screen. And one of the beauties of online teaching is that you can also be taking care of your kids, or walking your dog if your dog needs to be walked, or you can be cooking a meal, and also like your hair might be halfway braided. So if your camera cannot be on for whatever reason, that's cool too. So it's meant to be a welcoming space, an accommodating space, but also a community space. So if you can have it on, great. And if you can't, we also understand that as well. So those are a couple things that just about the basic ethics of the space. Let me now turn to what this particular class is going to be all about. And I just have to pull up my slides. Stop this share. Let me shrink the YouTube. Here we go. Why does that keep coming up for me? Okay. I keep getting sent back to the YouTube rather than to my slides. So just let me shrink that and try this one more time. Now I think we got it. Okay, are you guys able to see that? Perfect. And I'm gonna go one slide back. Here we go. So this was the lovely flyer that brought you guys in. And we're going to start with some explanation of the basic terms. As an academic and intellectual by training, I always want to make sure that the terms that are under discussion are, as Kwame Ture would always say in his discourses, it must be properly understood. So we need the terms to be properly understood from the outset so that we don't spin off into a variety of directions. So we are going to do a quick exegesis of this flyer so that you can understand the terms in which the conversation will be taking place over the next 2 days. So the first at the top of the screen, the roots of revolution. So the roots of revolution is what we have decided to entitle our new political education series for the Beware for Governor campaign. So we're going to be doing a roots of revolution on regular basis because the Panthers and Malcolm, and whether it was Oakland Panthers or Chicago Panthers, Kwame Ture said the same thing. They all said what our people need most is political education. So, and I'm an educator, so we're leaning into that as campaign activity, that political education, so that you guys feel that you are well grounded and well rooted and well versed in the history and theory of revolutionary practice so that you can now go out and engage in this time. So we're going to be going to the roots of revolution probably once a month. Roots in the truest sense, that we're going back to relevant historical examples, but we are thinking of this as a flowering tree, right? That what we are going to bring into being is new branches, new flowers, new fruit. But in order to do that, we have to understand the roots of our movements. What we're going to bring into being, and this is probably the most important epistemological statement about this gathering, what we are going to bring into being politically in this moment is unprecedented. It will not be a carbon copy of exactly what the Panthers did. It will not be a carbon copy of exactly what Frantz Fanon did, but we will learn the relevant lessons from their engagement, from their theory, and from their practice so that we can be rooted and anchored in sound revolutionary principles so that we can bring into being a successful revolutionary movement. We're going to come back to revolution in a moment. Um, but the piece that I'll just say about it now is that a revolution, in contradistinction to some who make a fetish of armed struggle, a revolution is simply a turning of the wheel that takes those that are on the bottom and puts them at the top. It takes the people that have been the downtrodden in society and makes them decision makers. And we are working on building a working class revolution. That's what this has to be. More on that in a moment. Frantz Fanon, you just got an introduction to him. I'm going to say a few more words of introduction as we move forward. But for those that need a little bit of a kind of basic introduction, Fanon was born in the French Antilles, Caribbean intellectual who, as the video showed you, went on to study psychology in France, earned his degree there because of his blackness of skin, could not find employment despite his excellent academic record in the metropole. So then he took a position in Algeria. He did all kinds of things once he was stationed in Algeria. Though he was not a Muslim, he understood that Islam was the most important system of religious reference and culture for the people around him. So at the clinic where he was stationed, he opened the prayer room and the mosque inside the clinic that had never been opened in 20 years previously. Fanon was somebody that deeply immersed himself in Algerian society and Algerian culture, and you can see that come out in his writing. As the film intimated to us, after the Philippeville uprising, where the resistance took out civilians as part of their resistance effort, Fanon understood that he was being presented with a choice, and he realized that he could no longer serve even as an anti-colonial agent inside colonialist institutions. So despite the fact that he had overcome systemic racism, incredible numbers of hurdles in order to achieve a degree in psychiatry and had reached this position of importance and significance in his profession, he was already a published author, having published Black Skins, White Masks while he was still in Paris. And Black Skins, White Masks is one of the homework assignments that you guys are going to have after this class. The homework assignment that you're going to have during this class, in between our two sessions, is Wretched of the Earth, especially the chapter concerning violence. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But just to finish the biographical sketch on Fanon, Fanon goes on to join the Algerian liberation movement. Not just putting his pen in service of the Algerian liberation movement, but literally um, becoming a resistance leader himself. Fanon puts aside his hard-earned bourgeois profession and throws his lot in with the oppressed and the marginalized, despite the fact, that as we know, like North Africa has anti-blackness just like every society on the planet, has anti-blackness. But Fanon understood that the anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle that Algerians were fighting was the same one that Caribbean intellectuals were fighting. It was the same one that Africans in sub-Saharan Africa were fighting. In fact, Fanon serves as the Algerian delegate for two separate Pan-Africanist congresses before he ultimately dies of leukemia. So he becomes a thought leader, an intellectual figure, a resistance fighter, and a resistance diplomat. And in so doing, he reveals this multifaceted strain of thought, which we're going to get into. If I was to summarize Fanon's thinking and his approach to revolution, he is a Marxist, Pan-Africanist revolutionary. And his principal contributions are rooted in the fact that he draws on the discipline that he is trained in, psychology, which we're going to come to in a moment, in order to provide the most probing analysis of the psychological effects of colonialism and imperialism for both the colonized and the colonizer alike. And that's why this particular class will move down to the next words on the flyer and the psychology of liberation, why this is our point of focus for this gathering. With all due respect, I've always had this problem with a classic bar from the legendary Audre Lorde, who is our teacher in so many things. But when she said master's tools can't be used to dismantle the master's house, all I could think of was Fanon. All I could think of was psychology being this Western institution that emerges essentially coterminous with imperialism and white supremacy extending across the globe in the 19th century, and how effectively Fanon is able to use this Western tool in order to systematically take apart every single part of the colonial mentality. And so my own personal, sort of reconciliation of Fanon's legacy and Audre Lorde's legacy is that I do think that you can just use master's tools to dismantle master's house. But I think that when it comes to building a new house, you need different tools. And I think that Fanon is this incredibly powerful thinker on decolonization precisely because he is using European intellectual instruments against them. He is defeating them on their own turf with their own tools and through their own arguments. But there is also more to be said about this. The more that is to be said about this is that psychology is it holds a particular place in a Western academic canon, but it emerges from multiple roots. The term psyche does not refer in its original Greek form to a fiction called the mind. It's not about mentality. Psyche in ancient Greek means soul, okay? And when you understand psychology as the science of the soul, then you realize that there are very many sources of indigenous knowledge, anti-colonial knowledge that are not rooted in Western ontologies and epistemologies that we can draw on for our anti-colonial psychology. So for those of you who have been in this space before, going back to when we were talking about the sciences of Sufism and West African Islam and the way that those have nourished anti-colonial resistance movements, don't worry, you are going to get a good solid dose of Islamic revolutionary psychology. For those of you that have studied ancestral traditions, indigenous American spirituality, ancient Egyptian spiritual systems, the sciences of the soul are the sciences of psychology. And we actually have multiple channels of pre-colonial indigenous forms of psychology that we can draw on as part of our liberation struggle. We're going to talk more about that in tomorrow's session than we do today. Tell me if the share came back on the screen just now. Just not? Okay, perfect. We're getting the hang of Zoom again. The last part, and we'll say more about psychology as we get in. The last part that I want to introduce with respect to terms is liberation. I left the term revolution hanging and suspended in the air a moment ago. And the reason that I did is that some that make a fetish of armed revolution or revolutionary struggle forget that revolution is the means, the end is liberation. I'm going to say that again. Revolution is just the means, the goal is liberation. The goal is to be free of these oppressive systems and to be able to author nourishing, sustainable, spiritually enriching forms of human organization, economic, social, political, and spiritual that actually meet our needs so that we can be free to be our fullest, truest selves. The aim is liberation. And whatever facilitates the accomplishment of the aim, we undertake. And whatever inhibits the accomplishment of the aim, we leave. But there is, especially in leftist circles, a tendency to make a fetish of the means, not understanding that we have to prioritize the end. We have to prioritize the goal. And once that happens, that will take us to another core part of our discourse over these next couple of days, which is that if your focus is primarily on the liberated society that you are trying to bring into being, then your goal is not so much the deconstruction and the tearing apart of extant systems of oppression. You are going to be much less focused in this narrow sense just on revolutionary interventions against the systems. You're going to be thinking about the systems that you are constructing through your process and through your praxis, because liberation is not going to come on Revolution Day. Liberation has to be built through the practices of revolutionary organizing and activism that lead to the outcome. If we reproduce the colonized habits of mind, and that's where we're about to go here in a minute, if we reproduce those colonized habits of mind through our revolutionary organizing, then we will inscribe our colonizers' oppression into our liberation, and it won't be liberation at all. It will not be revolutionary. It will be reactionary. And this is also one of those unfortunate lessons that comes in the aftermath of Fanon, in the aftermath of the Algerian Revolution. And the Panthers described this. The Panthers said that it was crazy sometimes seeing how quickly revolutionaries became reactionaries once they were in power. That people that had been part of anti-colonial nationalist movements, once they were in charge of directing the state, utilized state power in all kinds of oppressive and repressive ways. I'm going to humbly submit to you that that pattern has been a persistent part of our revolutionary struggles, precisely because we have not taken seriously Fanon's call and the call of other revolutionary thinkers to to first dethrone the oppressor that is inside of us, that is embedded in our habits of thought, that is embedded in our habits of mind. You guys hear me all of the time talking about organizing against systems, and I'm going to keep doing that. I'm still going to say revolutionaries don't just mobilize around issues, revolutionaries organize against systems. But for the people that are in a room like this, the ones that are not just soldiers in the affair, but the ones that are going to be responsible for training soldiers in the affair, it is most important that we free ourselves from our oppressors inside so that we are not having them ghostwrite our liberation movement for us. We do not want them as our ghostwriters. The last part of this introductory exegesis, and then I'll talk a little bit about the structure. Colonialism may wear new masks, but the fight for freedom remains. Dive deep into Fanon's explosive ideas and arm yourself with psychological tools for revolutionary resistance in today's struggle against imperialism. This is the reason why it's Frantz Fanon and the psychology of liberation, rather than Frantz Fanon on the psychology of liberation. Because one thing that you'll know about me is that as much as I love my revolutionary forebears and ancestors, that I am not afraid to critique their ideas so that we can better use them in our time. That we want to learn from them and venerate them and honor their example. But the best way to honor their exemplary teachings is not to make them museum artifacts, but to submit them to the test of our time and our moment. Because as much as Fanon provides us incredibly valuable insight, Fanon never saw 2025. Fanon never lived in a world where the primary instrument of surveillance that people have to engage with is a phone that they hold in their own hands. That the propaganda machine that was responsible for reproducing colonial psychoses, for lack of a better term, was one that, listen, I don't know what y'all screen time said for you last week, but I'd be having weeks where it would be like you're averaging 6 hours a day of screen time right now. You're averaging 8 hours a day of screen time right now. So all of this is to say is that we are taking the lessons from our revolutionary uh, forebears, giants, right? But the way that we are going to honor them is by engaging their ideas, not just quoting them like scripture, but actually engaging the substance of the ideas that they're bringing so that we can best learn how to apply those lessons to our current and contemporary moment. Everybody want to take a deep breath with me? That was me speeding through 20 minutes to try to do an introduction to the basic terms. You can slow that down and watch it on 0.75 speed if you need to. When you watch the YouTube video of this later, but that is laying down the groundwork for where we need to go. Now, just a couple words on logistics. Usually in this space, I try to do something like a 40 to 45-minute initial lesson, okay, where I'm going to set particular terms, perhaps analyze specific passages from a reading, but I'm also going to do this oftentimes through a didactic method. So I might just stop and ask y'all questions through the process. But one way or the other, usually after about 45 minutes of a kind of presentation, even if it has some back and forth in it, I'm gonna stop and just take questions. So if your questions are something that you want, kind of treated in a systematic fashion, write them down. We're gonna go to questions, probably in about 20 minutes, maximum. We're going to engage whatever questions you guys bring to the table. Those can be theoretical questions about the pieces that we discussed from Fanon's teaching or from from his biography, or an argument that might make about a lesson that we need to learn, or they can be a preoccupation that you guys have about where we are in this current moment and how we apply some of these principles to right where we are now. That literally might be about, the 2026 California gubernatorial election. It might be about how we appeal to working class voters. We specifically we had the choice of whether we're going to roll out this set of teachings as part of my 501c3 nonprofit educational, or to roll it out as a campaign function. And if we had done it as the 501c3, we would not have been able to talk explicitly about political organizing, and we would not have been able to use this essentially also as a political organizing meeting. So if you want to use this as a political organizing meeting, you can, and you should feel free to. Your questions can be ranging from Fanon or Islamic psychology, all the way through how do we get red voters in Lake County, California, to learn about the Green Party. We're open to all of those kind of questions. Usually I try to get through every hand, even if that takes 30, 45 minutes, and then I'll come back with a 15 minutes or so lesson that sets us up for our next lesson. So that's usually the basic roadmap. Do you guys have questions about that roadmap? Okay, well then if there's no objections, I'm gonna keep the train rolling. Let's get into Fanon. So your homework assignment for tonight is going to be, I'll do this two different ways. Your homework assignment for tonight is going to be to read from Wretched of the Earth. And I've just put it on the screen. I'm going to scroll up. We have the PDF. Fanon's estate does not make money from the publications of these books. The publishing houses do. So I don't have any compunction about violating their intellectual property rights and putting the whole last PDF up on the Revolutionary Learning Community. For those of you that might have just registered for the class and haven't yet joined Revolutionary Learning Community, please join Revolutionary Learning Community. Over there, we'll post the videos, and there's readings and other things. You can find that in my link tree. So you'll find this PDF there. You can skip right past the preface by Sartre. I'll never have you reading a French philosopher in anything that I assign. It's actually not a bad introduction, but that's just a standing rule that I have. And the chapter that I'd like you guys to focus on is this first one concerning violence. Um, because Frantz Fanon's theory and analysis, and the reason why he scares liberals to death is because of his analysis on the role of violence in anti-colonial struggle. And I know that many of you, not all of you, but many of you are recovering liberals. Um, uh, like not so many smiles on the faces when I said that. I was like, yeah, he spotted me. Um, lot could be a lot could be said about that. But there's a lot of unlearning and deprogramming that needs to happen around this particular point. Because at the same time that I say that there are too many people that make a fetish out of armed struggle, I will nonetheless always say that all of our revolutionary forebears understood that there was a time and a place for armed struggle. They all stood 10 toes down on the right of occupied people to resist their occupiers up to and including violence. And they also, as I have said on any number of occasions, conceived of resistance not as a right, but as a responsibility. That it is something that you must do. You are not allowed to allow yourself to be oppressed. You have to use whatever means that are at your disposal in order to keep harm from reaching people. And that means right up to armed struggle. Now, Fanon is going to say really, really important things about the psychological catharsis that comes through armed struggle, that there are all kinds of internal lessons that come through that armed struggle. And that's where we're going to start now. So first, we have to understand what we're up against, right? Um, it's one of the great, kung fu masters says, know yourself and then know your enemy, right? And if you know both of those things, then you cannot be defeated. So the psychology is about the knowing of the self, but you have to know what you're fighting against. You have to understand what imperialism is. You have to understand what colonialism is. So the first piece from Fanon that we'll take, colonialism is not a thinking machine, nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is violence in its natural state and will only yield when confronted with greater violence. Colonialism is not a thinking machine, nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence. This is incredibly important that you understand from the outset that imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and their specific iterations in the kind of settler colonialism that Fanon encountered in Algeria and that Palestinians are groaning under now, they are the naked exercise of power and violence in their purest form. You cannot reason with imperialism. And the first step in rehabilitating yourself from liberal habits of mind is disabusing yourself of the notion that you can reason with imperialism. Imperialism cannot be reasoned with, colonialism cannot be reasoned with, they must be fought. Now, the battleground on which they must be fought is the battlegrounds on which they must be fought are diverse, are numerous, but one of them always includes that armed resistance. Because they're even in what have looked like moments of reform that have come up, for example, in the history of Black liberation movements in the United States. People will point to the civil rights movement and the success of the civil rights movement and to supposedly nonviolent protest in producing outcomes. But this is a wildly misguided misrepresentation of the past on so many levels. The first is that people like Martin Luther King never did nonviolent protest. Martin Luther King did nonviolent direct action. He did not make an appeal so much as he threw obstacles into the ordinary functioning of capitalism, of white supremacy. See, a bus boycott is not a protest. That's direct action. uh, but what we have now, we essentially have like state-sponsored parades. People will fly halfway across the country to go march protesting within the boundaries of the police. People are literally flying halfway across the country to go follow cops' directions. And that's what happens when you make a fetish of nonviolent resistance as protest. Protest, protest does many things, but what it does not do is it does not move imperialism. Protest is how you find your people. Protest is where you find your kin. It's where you find your spiritual energy, your recharge. It's where you find out that a lot of people that look like this are just as down for, for the cause as some people that look like this. It's where your circle becomes bigger, and you learn to recognize one another, right? But what it does not do is that it does not fundamentally alter colonialism or imperialism unless it challenges them through power directly. And this is incredibly important to understand. Another one of those great revolutionary ancestors, Kwame Ture, said, the problem with nonviolent resistance is that it is predicated on your enemy having a conscience, and America has none. If you came into this gathering thinking that you can make a moral appeal to oppressors and it will stop them from oppressing, you need to leave that at the door. Because if they were susceptible to moral appeals, they wouldn't be oppressors. If they were susceptible to moral appeals, they wouldn't support apartheid. If they were susceptible to moral appeals, they wouldn't support genocide. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people that you can educate. There are. You can persuade people who have not been read in, and we've all seen this. Some of y'all just got unplugged from the war machine in the last 2 years because of the genocide in Gaza, correct? So you are living proof that people can learn, but the system itself, imperialism and colonialism, is not a rational body. You are. You are endowed with critical thinking faculties. You are endowed with rationality. Individuals are endowed with those things. The system is not. The system will reproduce its logic, and you can see that now. Because the Democrats, for example, despite the fact that their base is 80% against the genocide in Gaza, is going to keep right on rolling because imperialism is not a reasoning body. It will only respond to force. It will only respond to power versus power. Back to the slide. After lengthy, everybody able to see that? Okay. After lengthy discussion in the chapter concerning violence, which I want you guys all to read, and if you have a physical copy, like it should have post-it notes and everything in it by the time you're done with the chapter. Never read anything without a pen. Um, sorry, I'm going to go into professor mode just on this, like study skills, like 101. I'm going to go into professor mode on this. You will never remember everything that an author says in a book. You will never even actually remember all of the argument or the pieces of the argument that the author made, much less the different kind of evidence or the bases on which they make those arguments. What you will always remember if you start reading with a pen is the understanding that you were able to formulate through engagement with the book. I never remember exactly the argument. I remember what I took from it. I have to go back for exactly how they threaded the needle for the argument. But the part of the argument that I can use becomes a part of me. So develop your own understanding of the argument and put that understanding of the argument in your heart and let that become an organic part of who you are. That's how you can utilize an argument in the world, right? Is that when it's become a part of you because it's become an organic part of your understanding. So don't just write down what the author said, but write down what it's doing to your thinking, right? Um, Create that archive for yourself of your own engagement. So Fanon lays out this very careful argument about what is learned through the armed struggle. And it's not a theoretical question. He's writing this in the midst of armed struggle. And he writes, thus the native discovers that his life, his breath, his beating heart are the same as those of the settler. He finds out that the settler's skin is not of any more value than a native skin. And it must be said that this discovery shakes the world in a very necessary manner. All the new revolutionary assurance of the native stems from it. For if, in fact, my life is worth as much as the settler's, his glance no longer shrivels me up nor freezes me, and his voice no longer turns me to stone. What Fanon is pointing us to, and this is the most important part of our opening conversation today, is the psychological trauma that colonialism and imperialism inscribe upon us. They write a word inside our heart and inside our being that we must somehow undo, that we must somehow write a new word, erase that one, right? We have to undo all of the pattern behaviors of learning that capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism have inscribed on our inner beings. And Fanon is 100% right when he says that armed struggle is one of the places where that happens. They bleed just like you bleed. Sorry, anybody remember Predator, the original Predator movie? If it bleeds, I can kill it, right? Like they feel like they're being hunted by something that can't be defeated. But when they realize that it bleeds just like they bleed, well, if it bleeds, I can kill it. And if I can kill it, it means that I can win. What did Ho Chi Minh say? Ho Chi Minh said, you will be able to kill us, 10 of us for every one of you. And yet, even at those odds, you will never defeat us. Right? That even when you are put up in a position of tactical disadvantage, that if you understand that your enemy can be hurt, then you are in a position of tactical strength. And it's the reason why the Vietnamese were able to destroy two of the top imperialist powers of the 20th century, the French and the United States. It's the reason why the Haitians were able to send Napoleon packing. It's the reason why in the Palmares Quilombo in Brazil in the 17th century, 100,000 formerly enslaved African and indigenous people were able to start not a maroon colony, but a state within a state because they were willing to fight for it, because they understood that through fighting, they could make it so hard on their oppressors that they would have to desist. And that's the reason why, and sorry for the parentheses in this conversation, but I was at an event not too long ago with the College of Sequoia students. It's a group, College of Sequoia Social Justice Club, amazing students. And we had some folks from Gaza Zoom in. and engage with the people. So somebody asked, well, what do you say to people who don't support the resistance, who don't support the armed resistance on the ground in Palestine? And the brother, he put it so beautifully. He said, he said, anyone who does not support the resistance is a traitor. That's it. If you do not support the resistance, you do not support Palestinian liberation. You are a traitor. Because it is only through those resistance struggles that your efforts inside the metropolitan capital will be successful. This goes back to a loop that I wanted to close from earlier. It wasn't just that King was engaged in nonviolent direct action. It was also that the legislative efforts and the nonviolent direct action existed in a dialectic relationship with the fact that Black folks lit this country on fire in the Watts riots, lit this country on fire in King riots, is that it was the dialectic between the fear of popular uprising and the pressure internal to systems that produce whatever progress was made. Do not ever, ever speak against the people that are willing to put their lives on the line in order to fight for liberation. Because it means that you have internalized a series of bourgeois norms that will leave colonialism unchallenged. Now, what is this decolonization that Fanon is driving us towards? It was described in the video that you guys watched on the way into class. And when you get to the end of the book, uh, when you get to the end of Wretched of the Earth, there's a couple of appendices that are nice to read, Colonial War and Mental Disorders, where he goes into kind of an analysis of all of the colonial PTSD that folks suffer. But if you go back to Black Skins, White Masks that he writes, probably it's either in like 52 or 54, almost a decade before he writes Wretched of the Earth, that's where he talks about the dream that colonized people have of turning white. And they talked about it in the video. And that's what the argument of Black Skins, White Masks is all about. It's about how the colonizer, their most effective form of violence against you is an internal violence that you reproduce inside of yourself. You absorb their standard of beauty. You absorb their models of normativity. You absorb bourgeois fictions like violence is bad and nonviolence is good. And instead of challenging those, you reproduce them systematically without the colonizer having to make any effort to do so. One of my favorite books, and I recommended this during my my Black August lives that I've been doing on Revolutionary Learning Community from time to time, is a great book by a Senegalese author. His name is Sheikh Hamadou Khan, and the book is called Ambiguous Adventure. And it is the best fictional representation of this process that I've ever seen. It starts with a boy who grows up in Senegal in African Quran schools and then goes on to get a colonial education and then an education in France. And he unpacks how his consciousness is being colonized from the inside. He's being alienated from himself and he can feel it, but he can't stop it, right? Du Bois wrote about this in The Souls of Black Folk. He described it as double consciousness. He said that he said it is the feeling of always measuring your own soul with another man's tape. That the you that you assess is always in terms that have been dictated to the other. And it has been Black folks that have been the most articulate in making this argument about the efforts of kind of racial colonization. Apply it to the class struggle. How many working class people have absorbed capitalist norms and reproduced them systematically and spontaneously inside their own selves without any effort so that they become the most effective instruments for their own oppression that could possibly be conceived? I'm going to tell you a story just because I'm looking at the time and I'm doing all right on time. I'm going to tell you a quick story. One of the most important lessons that I ever learned was from a mentor. For his name's Mahmoud El Khati. He's getting on in age. May God give him good health and long life. He was a professor at a neighboring university when I was, kind of first coming into political consciousness. So we would run into each other at like, revolutionary bookstores, and I remember we were coming out of one lecture one time, and he turned to me and he said, Butch, do you know how they train elephants at the circus? And I was like, nah, like I didn't know what he was talking about. And I said, I'm sure I don't know how they train elephants at the circus. And he said, well, they have to whip them hard because even in their infancy, a baby bull elephant, if it gets loose, can trample a half dozen people in a matter of seconds. They whip them and they tie heavy chains around essentially the ankle of the animal to the point where the chain pierces into the animal's flesh. And they take those chains and they tether them to iron pegs that are anchored in concrete so that every time that animal tries to run from its captivity, it finds that it is futile, which I mean, I probably don't need to tell this group this, but don't go to the circus, right? I mean, like that's an incredibly, don't go to SeaWorld, don't go to the circus. These are insane spaces. But he was going somewhere else with this. He said, but once that animal is broken, he said, you can take any insignificant lash and just play with it in the air. He said, you can take any insignificant cord, tie it around its ankle, tether it to any insignificant peg, and that animal will never run. And then he asked me a question that I now asked you. He said, do you know why I'm telling you this story? So I asked you guys the question that he asked me. Do you know why I'm telling you this story? Go ahead, give me a hand. Anybody? Blake, I see Blake. Go ahead. Talk to us, Blake.
It's in relation to his mindset, also like the institutionalization of people in the carceral system. It's just the fact that once we've been broken, we continue to break ourselves.
Exactly. If you can teach a people to colonize themselves, then you will never fear uprising. And this is what Fanon is learning in African independence movements. After the break, we're going to talk about how he describes the nationalist bourgeoisie. We're going to talk more about class structures. But what he's coming to understand is that, and Khan said this in Ambiguous Adventure, he said, the school is the more effective instrument of colonization than the cannon. One of my colleagues has a beautiful piece of cannons and cannons. So Cannon and Canon. So right of literary of physical cannons and literary cannons. And the literary cannons are the more dangerous because they teach you how to think in terms that reproduce your oppression without you being aware that you're reproducing your oppression. Malcolm put it in these terms. He said, never let your enemy tell you how many of you there are. Never let the man that you are against form your opinions for you. That the first step towards our successful liberation is to let loose the chains that are placed on our consciousness, that are placed on our psychology, that are placed on our mentalities, because we are reproducing these forms of bondage spontaneously and voluntarily. We walk around with them voluntarily, signing up for 24-hour surveillance, right? And reproducing it inside our hearts and inside all of our actions. The reason why I'm so intensely grateful for this kind of space, and my campaign, team is like, yes, keep doing the bottom of the funnel activities. And I'm like, huh? And they're like, well, you have to have top of the funnel activities that bring new people into the space, but then you got to have things for the people that have been in the space that need more of it. And I was like, oh yeah, yeah, no, that's this group. Like that, this is that bottom of the funnel group that needs to have like the deep analysis of it. That's why I'm so grateful for these spaces, because in these spaces we can undertake this incredibly important work that is not taking place in our organizing outside of these spaces. There is so little attention paid to healing from the trauma of colonial psychoses and to deploying the tools of our ancestral traditions and our resistance traditions, not just to struggle against the systems, but to undo the internal programming that takes place, if it takes place at all, at a very, very superficial level. And oftentimes it is placed in terms that are, like deeply counterproductive and that play right into liberal identity politics, right? So this is one of the reasons why I'm so deeply grateful on this particular question for the late great Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks would always remind people that white supremacy is not a white people's problem. White supremacy is threaded through all of our institutions, and any of us can become agents for reproducing it. And we all learned this, some of y'all just learned it because of Kamala. A few of us learned it, like because of Obama, right? And some of us had it, before that, is that in many ways that black bourgeoisie is the most dangerous. The ones that reproduce the habits of mind and the systems of white supremacy while cosplaying, blackness or oppressed status. So all of this, the conversation that we have to have today is about how we actually come to understand racism as a mental illness, colonization and colonialism as productive of neuroses and psychoses that we must engage in systematic healing in order to address. I'll stop there because that's right on 50 minutes, and we'll take the first round of questions, and then we'll come back into conversation after that. So I see Ugbad has a hand up. The raise hand function should now be under, it's probably under reactions now. Is it under reactions? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Assalamu alaikum, Ugbad. Welcome back. Oh, hold on, let me ask you to unmute again.
Walaikum salam, doctor. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Alhamdulillah. I have a reflection that I want to reflect on. SubhanAllah. The Imam was talking about this, erasing the people's history will make them
So hold on, you're
be...
just so the people that are present, this you're speaking about Imam Fode Drame, correct?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
yes.
wonderful. And if you guys ever get a chance, one of the greatest living kind of traditionally trained West African scholars, Imam Fode Drame, he's based in Vancouver now, and just what wonderful teaching. So go ahead, Ugbad.
Alhamdulillah. He was reflecting in his last speech, talking about Malcolm X. He was talking about erasing the history of the people and the idols from their lives.
Yeah.
They will not have anything to hold on, and they will have that in bondage, being under the captive of colonialism.
Excellent.
And subhanAllah, one of the sisters also shared from their recent trip to Africa. They are seeing like Muslim people making idols to sell it for tourists. And this is the caption that you were talking about, the same idea of the elephant being in...
Yeah.
SubhanAllah, it's like, because they closed all the ways of sustenance for them, and they told them this is the only resource that you have, even though their history, they were doing farming, and the Imam was reflecting on, it's like they were doing beautiful clothings that's not
and now they're making fake tourist art, and African idols, despite the fact that it's in a region that has been Muslim for 1,000 years, and that their folk art was Islamic art, and that their folk art was in hand woven clothing. They're now spontaneously conforming to colonial tourist norms, correct?
Yes. yes.
So
And he was talking about the colonialism, the tourism and the colonialism is like two face for one coin, subhanallah. And we were reflecting on that so deep. So how come it can affect? And he explained it uh, close to the same way that you explained it. And subhanallah, it's true. Once we are detached from our history, from our fitra, from the people that we had idols or examples to follow, then we have no stand or firm ground that we can stand on, and we can hang on any rope that will be thrown to us just to survive in this life. We
excellent.
have no base foundation, so we just want to survive in this life. No matter what, we have no um, basics that we are holding on. We have no firm faith or root. Even he was talking about like the things, it's like the pots that we're making from clay. Everything has connected to earth to keep our fitra, our natural disposition, making clothes, farming, making these pots from the clay just to preserve our fitra, to be connected to the earth as much as we can. And this was not so long ago. It's like 50 years ago it was present, but now it's like in the
It's
history,
under
and
assault. It's under assault.
yes,
So
yes.
if I may just bring this into the conversation, and thank you
Mm-hmm.
for reminding me of this, Ugbad. So um, erasing the history of a people. As I've said on any number of occasions, the only reason why a colonizer ever tries to pull your history away from you is so that when they tell you who you are, you'll have no choice but to believe them. So that the narratives of our past, and this is why it's so important to go back to those roots of revolution. It's not that they're going to provide a cookie cutter answer, but we learn who we are by studying that past, and that past can never be taken from us and broken. And as a historian, this is incredibly important for me. Malcolm actually also said this. Malcolm said, of all of our fields of study, history is best qualified to reward our research. And with respect to Imam Farid Drame, I will never forget. Imam Farid Drame once said when we were traveling together, he said, he said, the only reason why a colonizer ever tries to get you to put down your culture is so that as soon as you drop it, they can pick it up. Right? And then when I said that in the previous class, somebody said, yeah, and then sell it right back to you. Right. They're going to process it and sell it right back to you. They're going to take the raw materials and turn it into something that exploits you. And what Ugbad was alluding to, what this concept of fitra in the Islamic tradition, fitra is our innate natural disposition, that the human being comes in sound, right? And that we're connected to the earth and to the water, the two things of which the human being is comprised. And so that even the traditional pottery was the bringing together of the earth and the water and the molding of that with the hands. And now it's cheap plastic tourist art instead of earth and water. And it's all separating us from the organic traditions that made us into people, not over centuries, over millennia, right? And that colonialism produces this breach in our selfhood and this break in our selfhood, and produces all kinds of innate dependencies inside of us, so that we then have to turn towards our colonizers for meaning, right? And this is the reason why it is so crucial that we reconnect with those sources. And as Ugbad reminded us, we've got living exemplars of these traditions amongst us. Imam Fode Drame is one of them. May God give him good health and long life. Go ahead, brother Drew. Good to see you.
Yeah, happy to be here today. Thanks for holding this space. I mentioned on my network, for me, Fanon was like really a pivotal point in my development. Like I was at Santa Cruz when I encountered him and was immediately like, okay, I'm gonna fully immerse myself in the history of consciousness department. Like that's the
Mm.
intersection of everything in that department. And there's a lot of great thinkers that I just wanted to bring in some concepts from them into the
Please.
conversation. Because for me, it's been kind of how I've navigated. Both my parents are California liberals, very much like literate, but totally politically disengaged, you know? So it was interesting growing up, like discovering all the things that they were not curious about and not reflective about. And yeah, and especially being at Santa Cruz, there's a lot of the kind of stuff we've been talking about today. I often call it like psychedelic imperialism, that like because I really think the etymology of psyche is important, as you brought up, that it's not I deal with that with people all the time around me, that like everything is in your brain. It's all contained in your brain. You're just crazy about the world, and it's this pathologization of wanting to even reflect on justice. And that's the main book that I wanted to bring up, because I think this book for me has just totally, I think about it every day. Like it just comes up all the time for me. It's called After Evil, A Politics of Human Rights by Robert Meister. And the core argument is based on the title, that he's talking about the kind of linguistic and psychological construction of the post-war order after World War II, and how US slavery and the Holocausts in Germany and other places really like affected the psychological construction of that international order. And he basically makes the argument that we cannot even conceive of evil in the present. It's like based on this total denial that evil exists now. It's always in the past or potentially in the future, and it's never here with us. And I think I see that reflected in Marxist spaces all the time, that there is a total anti-psychology, a total anti-theology, and of course
Yeah.
we should think scientifically, but yeah, there's many more things I could go into about that, and I don't want to take up too much space, but I want to bring in the concepts that he talks about in the book, that he talks about the dynamic between the perpetrator of violence and the victim of violence, but then there's also a third party, the beneficiary, who does directly in the violence, but benefits from it. And that psychology, I have so many books I want to talk about in the book club about it, because for me, it's been like learning about that. I was like, oh, now I get my whole life. Like I get everybody that's been, it just was a total aha moment for me reading that book. And I had a chance to take a class with him, which was really lucky. So I'm excited to go more into those things, but I just wanted to bring that idea into the space. And yeah.
And also a couple of things. I mean, one, since we're going to be doing Roots of Revolution probably on a monthly basis, I haven't been able to manage the Revolutionary Book Club, and so I definitely think that this needs to become a Revolutionary Book Club potluck. So Drew, if you're down to lead the discussion of one of those works, I'm going to come and sit and pay attention like everybody else. So that's just number one as a logistical point. Let's get the Revolutionary Book Club, back cooking again. I want to go back to a couple of pieces. So the first is something that I've said in a wide variety of spaces, but you open the door for it to be said again here. There's an anti-theology, and somebody put it also into the chat, anti-spirituality. And this is one of the things that's at the forefront of my consciousness when I'm talking about speaking back to some of those legends. So Kwame Ture is one of my intellectual heroes. Really deeply committed Marxist and anti-imperialist thinker, and because he's clear about understanding what scientific Marxism is, he has the audacity to argue with Marx, which you have to do. So he says at a talk at the University of Hawaii, he said, when Marx and Engels said that religion is the opiate of the masses, it's only true for Europe. And he said that if you study the indigenous traditions of Africans and people all around the globe, you immediately see all of the times that religious and spiritual movements were used for liberation purposes. And then he said, he was speaking in the University of Hawaii, he said, if the indigenous people of Hawaii were ever to try to get free from their oppression without reference to their ancestral traditions, he said that they would find themselves running in circles. And this is one of the things that is really, really crucial, is that I've never read a more probing and trenchant analysis of European capital than Marx. Um, you'll get that, from me, no problem. But Marx does not understand African indigenous religions. He can't. He doesn't know the first thing about them. And if you read my first book, The Walking Quran, I'm writing about an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movement that is motivated entirely by African Islamic conceptions 100 years before Marx is born. So all of that is just to say that we don't know what we don't know, right? And that we have to, if we are serious about the process of decolonization, we have to be, willing to root ourselves in these traditions and engage them, because they're Yeah, so Drew made the point in 1,000 different ways, and thank you for bringing that into the conversation, Drew. It's really important. I'll go to the next hand. I'll close the list of hands now. I've got 6 up, so I'll go to. Pardon me for mispronouncing the name. Is it Jahangira, or how should I say it?
You pronounced it correctly.
Okay, great.
Beautiful. So wanted to take the time to ask, since you didn't mention taking notes, what would you say is a particularly useful note-taking way just to navigate reading?
Excellent. I'll give 2 answers to this. The first is a particular way to take away benefit from Fanon. And I'll try to provide the tools that you need for this in the second part. So the first principle of a sound analysis of any text is to know as much as you can about the context of production of that text and the audience of that text. Rule number 1. So in my second half, the second presentation that I'm going to give, it's setting you guys up for that. There's things that I want to tell you about how African independence movements are unfolding, about how indirect rule functions in colonial African states, because that's what Fanon is writing against and about. So as a general principle, get as much information as you can about the context when you're engaging the text. The second thing is that I find, and this may not be the case for everyone, but I think that it's more universally true than a lot would assume. Write your way to clarity. So what I mean by that is don't try to take notes in a passive way. Try to write something productive, like try to come up with declarative statements about reality and the world that are coming to you through the reading, right? Seek out not just those pins, like where you're just putting a pin in an idea because you want to come back to it later, but think about how to like articulate something, because oftentimes our notes are just, oh, this is something that I thought was interesting. Well, write about it. Put the text to the side and write a paragraph in response to that interesting passage, because usually I will write my way to clarity and sometimes just speak my way to clarity, right? That if I engage with a clear heart on an idea that is interesting, but I don't know why I think it's interesting, right? Like I don't know what it is about this passage or this particular framing that is striking me as important. And I won't know until I try to explain it, until I try to say what's at the bottom of it. And that's a more productive kind of engagement with the text. That would be my kind of principal counsel. I don't know if that is helpful, but that's how I do it. And now one last part on that is that if you're ever asked to write things, this is also an important part of practice, is oftentimes the best way to do it, and this is something that I'm known for years in my academic life, people will come to me just for this, is don't write an outline for something you need to write a post outline. And what I mean by that is just write a really, really gross, sloppy, stupid draft where you don't pay any attention to choosing the right word or punctuation. Just get ideas out and let them flow, right? And then separate yourself from the text and go back to each paragraph in your draft and try to summarize it with a single line so you can see if you can figure out where you're going with that paragraph. And usually you'll get one of 3 outcomes. Either you'll be able to summarize it with a single line, or you'll have to take 2 or 3 lines, which means you've got 2 or 3 competing main ideas that you're trying to work your way through, or you won't even be able to get to a single line with your summary because you're mostly treading water and you didn't really get anywhere. And that's okay, because the treading water is how you arrive at clarity about things. So I'm a big believer in writing your way to clarity, and I make it part of my regular practice. I'll go to Afnan.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you so much for doing this course. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from you. I wanted to ask, obviously we live now in a time with the internet. We have a lot of access to, for example, Imam Fodid Drami, who I am intending to learn from. But I was asking, is it important to learn from a mentor in person, and how can we go about it, especially with the mainstream Islam sometimes having un-Islamic ideas?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'll answer it both in the Islamic context and in the broader context for those of us here that may not be Muslims. So one of the things I wrote about in my first book is the ethics of knowledge acquisition in traditional Islam, and then I actually found out that this is really part of the ethics of knowledge acquisition across traditional indigenous societies, throughout the globe, is that there is no um, substitute for being in the presence of your teachers, right? And that there's a great passage from a medieval treatise. One of the greatest calamities of our time is that people take texts as sheikhs, people take texts as teachers. And the reason is that, one of the great thinkers in the Islamic tradition, Imam Malik, he said, knowledge is a light that God casts into the breast of whosoever he wills. It is not the accumulation of many facts. And if you understand that real knowledge is a light that is contained in the breast, it's transmitted from breast to breast, it's transmitted from person to person. And it's like this unextinguishable flame that is passed from heart to heart. And in our tradition, we often say that knowledge and love are the two things that the more you share them, the more you give them away, the more you're increased in them. Right? That when you engage in the practice of transmitting love and of transmitting light, of transmitting knowledge, that doesn't diminish you in that thing, it increases you in it. So now so yes, you can learn things from text and from online, but those are mostly gonna to affect your rational critical faculties, whereas knowledge, truly speaking, is illumination. It's something that is deeper than just ideas. Man, okay, hold on, let me go back for this one. With respect to that idea about colonized mentalities, right, and how you unpack it, the Quran, and it was Imam Farid Drame that pointed this out to me the first time, the Quran never uses the word mind, not one time. The Quran posits that the heart is the center of reasoning faculties. The heart, they have hearts, but they don't reflect with them. They have hearts, but they don't think with them. 200 times the heart is mentioned in the Quran, not a single mention of the mind. And that got me to thinking, where do we get this idea of a mind from, right? Somebody talked about the brain. Well, usually when I say to classes, I'll say this to my students, quick, point to your mind, they'll go like this. And I said, no, that's your brain. That's a physical organ that exists inside your body. The mind is a concept that comes out of post-Enlightenment rationalist thought that is conflating your thinking with the neural firings in your brain. But if you actually go back to ancient indigenous systems across the globe, Chinese philosophy, ancient Egyptian, ancient Native American, the heart is the center of intellection and understanding in all of those traditions. And so when I really want to put a fine line on this, I say, how are you ever going to get free if even the instrument that you think with was provided to you by your colonizer? Now, it doesn't mean that the brain doesn't have a function. That's still a physiological organ. I'm a big believer in neurological sciences, but the heart is a metaphysical concept. It's something that goes beyond just biology. And it's something that has been at the heart, sorry, of all of humanity's traditions of thinking and of spirituality. So like cultivating presence of heart is something that's absolutely crucial. Um, in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we move on, but I wanted to finish the last part of that question. For those of you that are not looking to like sit with an Islamic teacher and get to a more sound understanding of Islam, you still need to sit with revolutionary teachers. And I'm going to tell you, and there will be people in this room that can attest to this, is that when we've had in-person versions of these online classes, the people that are present in the room get things out of it that you cannot get across a Zoom screen. That's just the reality of what it is to be in relationship and to be in shared space and to break bread. Like Bobby was in the room at the SEIU candidate for him. Bobby, you had heard me speak on the internet. Now, this is going to sound like vainglorious boasting, but I'm trying to prove a point. Bobby, you had heard me speak a number of times on social media, on the internet. What was it like the first time actually being in the room?
It was palpable. Like you could feel it in a different way. I mean, like you are who you present yourself to be online, but the energy exchange that happens when you're in presence with somebody is totally different than right now.
Perfect. That's exactly the term. The energy exchange is completely different because this goes back to another one of those teachings is that ultimately, and this is something that's rooted in West African Sufi ontology, that the tongue is an auxiliary channel of communication. All real communication takes place between hearts, and that you can feel who is present at the core of their being and who is speaking from the heart and to the heart. And that is easy to discern from people who are just saying pretty words. Kamoya.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if you could give any other context or ideas to what you brought up earlier when you said we could use this group or this class as a local political organizing meeting. Because my Palestine Action Group invited me to this, and I took a break from Instagram. I've talked to you like only twice on Instagram. And I took a break from Instagram because I couldn't keep my mental health while I was on it.
It's really bad for your mental health. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, go ahead.
So I only heard about this in person from my actual like living, breathing comrades. I'm so thankful for that. And so now it's making me think about how much more important the meetings that we share with people that are in our local flesh and blood community instead of like only relying on Instagram to get the word out. And that's where my question came from. Yeah.
I appreciate the question and the share. So I'll say two things. The first is, especially if you're in California, but not exclusively if you're in California. If you want to organize an event for me to come through and to speak to your communities, I'll always come if we can schedule it logistically. So that's number one. And we found that like that's been a very incredibly like effective movement building device. So I'll just give an example. The first event that we did in San Diego, it was probably 40 people gathered in the backyard, or not the backyard, the kind of back patio of a great barbecue restaurant, actually, as it happened. Well, 20 of those people came out of that 40 person gathering as volunteers for the campaign. So that the next time I came back for an event, those people that were attendees at that talk had become volunteers. And we walked into Hillcrest Library with its standing room only, probably 150 people bursting out the door. So the point is that whatever communities you're connected to, if you can get people together for something, it doesn't even have to be specifically about my campaign. That one that we did in San Diego was about the impact of APAC on our politics, right? But the point is that if we can create those face-to-face interactions that are rooted in relationship and rooted in community, those go very far. Don't get me wrong, these conversations in this online space do too. There are many of us that have been coming to this space for our spiritual sustenance for the last 5 years, and I'm one of them. I know. Like I get my spiritual sustenance in large part through being able to engage with people that are dispersed in space and even in time zones. But there is no substitute for that face-to-face work, and especially as we are, and I'll just say this, with respect to the political movement that I'm trying to help direct, with all due respect to the Green Party veterans, the Green Party has been lousy at foot boots on the ground infrastructure and community building. And I am not going, like, that's not going to be the case on my watch. So that's why I'm up and down the state, showing up in person for those builds. And because there is no substitute for that face-to-face community. And I've asked each one of those gatherings, okay, well, there were 20 of us here today, or there were 30 of us here today. If each person that's here today brings 3 people to the next one, then we're going to be 100 people tomorrow, and we're going to be 300 people the next time after that. So if you are trying to build those conversations, and I can be somebody that comes in to help focalize some of that energy, I'm all for it. Just call on me and I'm there.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, my pleasure. Ariana.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your earlier reference to the chained elephant in the context of decolonization. The Black radical tradition teaches us that the human-animal divide has to go. As long as anyone can be relegated to the animal realm, which is the realm where you can just be subjected to legally and ethically condoned massive scale, unlimited violence, we're not all going to be free. Fanon talks about this early on in The Wretched of the Earth. He says, the terms that the colonizer uses for the colonized are zoological terms.
Brute beasts. Yep.
Yeah, Sylvia Wynter is also a key thinker in this thinking about, the human category is an innately exclusionary category to which, members of other species are excluded from it, and members of our, so-called species are throughout history removed from it, as we're seeing in Palestine. So, a lot of us have, been thinking about how animal liberation has to be a fundamental component of total liberation. Many of us have been following the Black Palestinian-led Sulala Animal Rescue for the last couple of years. Unfortunately, I only found out about them in October 23. Probably there are people on the call who are following them long, long before. So I would be grateful if you could speak to this question. How do you see this? How do you see the human-animal binary? There's another thinker, Claire Jean Kim. She's a political scientist at UC Irvine. She's done really interesting work on how, the animal or how whiteness, or the idea of the human capital H, which is the human in the white imaginary, is always constructed as the opposite of that which is Black and the opposite of that which is animal. So these concepts are inherently linked from the beginning, and I would be so grateful for your thoughts about this.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And I mean, it's definitely something that I can be more educated on. I mostly know of how to approach the question through African and Islamic historical examples, because those are the ones that I'm, trained in, most carefully. So the place that I would actually start would be with a reference that you might find interesting, is that there's a medieval Islamic treatise called The Case of the Plants and the Animals Against Humanity, as judged by the Lord of the Jinn. So this is a very interesting it's actually a treatise on Islamic conceptions of ecology and interaction with the animal and plant kingdoms, but also the spiritual realm. So jinn in the Islamic conception are essentially spiritual beings. They're energy beings, is the way that you would think about it in a contemporary sense. And the argument that is really threaded through the sustainable and authentic version of the Islamic tradition, especially as it's been practiced in Africa, is that human beings are stewards and caretakers of a natural environment of which they are an integral part. That it is our responsibility to engage all of the creation from a standpoint of mercy and compassion. Now, I'm not a vegan, and I get heat from that, sometimes online, but I often explain to people that if you understand the reason for halal meat in the Islamic tradition and the Zabiha tradition, it's because Muslims are by definition vegetarian. And that only the pronunciation of invoking a supreme deity could give the human being the right to take life in order to provide sustenance for the body. And that is echoed in a lot of indigenous North American, Native American traditions, as well as in longer term African traditions. It's echoed in ancient Egyptian traditions where meat was consumed, but much less than today, and certainly not on the scale of these massive torture chambers and slaughter houses, where animals are cut to ribbons. So all of that is just to say that there absolutely is a kind of fundamental animal and human and ecological and environmental ethic that is united across ancestral traditions across the globe that capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism have fundamentally breached because they turn everything into commodities. And that at the root is this profoundly alienating move, is that once you turn everything into commodities, then everything ultimately is going to be stripped down and sold for parts. And that starts with land and animals. And now it's you. And now it's literally every last one of your tastes and preferences has been commoditized and is now sold, for data, right? And that what's at the root of all of this is something that profoundly alienates us from our lowercase h human nature. I see Art's hand. Sorry, Art. You'll have to press the unmute button.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Mhm.
I need some clarification on what you mean by the need for pure violence to overcome violence. And we're talking, well, let me just frame it a little bit. It seems
Sure.
we live in a world that's congested with violence, from nuclear weapons at the top to climate boiling to the things you were just describing and us being taken apart for parts and sold. We're in a country that has 25 million AR-15s, and I don't
Yep.
have one. Do I need to get some more AR-15s to be able to overcome the? And we've got violence in education, entertainment. We got violence at the state level, militarized violence at the federal level, state level, local police. How much more violence do we need, and how can we use more violence to overcome all that violence? It seems somehow contradictory to me. So maybe you could clarify that.
It's an excellent question, and you pointed back to something that I raised at the beginning, is that you have to know when to argue with your heroes. So you'll notice that when I began my analysis of Fanon, I did not say that it will only yield to greater violence. I said it will only yield to greater power, right? And the reason for that is that for me, um, I go to Malcolm for help on this, and I go to the Black armed self-defense tradition for help on this that provides moral clarity on the question. So Malcolm was once asked about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, and he gave a response that was similar to what Walter Rodney said. Walter Rodney, another great third world Marxist, said that he said, what scale of morality would compare the violence of a colonizer to the violence of people that would resist? And what Malcolm said that makes it better is he said that is not violence. He said we cannot call it violence, we call it self-defense. We have too much violence. We do not need more violence. And it's the reason why Malcolm was never cited for any kind of violent activity. Neither was Fannie Lou Hamer, but they were both vocal partisans of a self-defense tradition that was rooted in the moral responsibility of keeping the people that are in your care safe. And what Malcolm contributed to the conversation is he said, that is not violence. That is the opposite of violence. I said this in a Middle East Eye interview before I got invited to run for political office. I said that the right of people to resist their occupation is enshrined in international law. we're not going to have a conversation about people's right to defend themselves. But what I wanted to talk about was the responsibility for us to defend ourselves, that we're not supposed to allow people to be harmed. And that's rooted in a basic understanding, right? Which is that if somebody takes something from you or seeks to harm you, that is an unequivocal moral wrong. But it is also a moral wrong for you to allow people to be harmed when you have the capacity to stop it. That isn't violence, that's resistance. That isn't violence, that's self-defense. Now, with respect to our political philosophy, we believe firmly that in denuclearization, believe firmly in demilitarization. If I'm ever allowed anywhere near the White House again, the first thing that's going to happen is that within a year, we will go from 800 US military bases around the globe to about 25. And within 10 years, that'll be down to about 5. Right? That the goal is to pull people away from the violence that inheres in capitalism and imperialism and in white supremacy. However, that cannot entail subjecting people to needless harm or disarming people. You do not have to go and get an AR-15. You don't. But you should have people in your community that will be doing rapid response when ICE is trying to kidnap people. You should have people in your community that are doing ICE watch. You should be filming the cops. We should be doing everything that we can to counter the effects of violence. And when things escalate to the point where our physical struggle is needed and self-defense is needed, then we do need to know. I mean, I don't know how what your eyesight is like. Mine, I'm 51 and my eyes are already starting to go. I don't know how good a shooter I'm going to be for too much longer. It's not everybody that needs to be a shooter, but people do need to be responsible for keeping our community safe. And that's not violence, that's resistance. Our school systems are violence. Our capitalist economic system, that's violence. And what we are talking about is care. And part of care is self-defense. I hope that clarifies, the position, and I appreciate the opportunity to at least try. Is it Valielsa?
It's Valielta.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Dr. Ware. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone being part of the discussion. It's been really great. And yeah, I think Art pretty much covered what I was going to ask. It was also going to be in regards to violence. And I recently finished Elaine Brown's memoir, A Taste of Power.
Yeah.
And it was really my first deep dive into the Black Panther Party, into the ideological divides, learning about the split between like the Huey Newton faction and the Eldridge Cleaver faction.
Yep.
And Eldridge Cleaver was very much in favor of a, much more like militant, violent, like revolutionary structure.
He romanticized violence for violence sake. And
exactly.
You will never get that from me. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I appreciate it. And yeah, I think it was really, really instructive to see, especially being part of a few leftist organizations myself. It was validating to see a lot of those same struggles kind of come up again and again. You have people who think that it's more effective to take up arms immediately or to build bases of support in the community. And yeah, it just really resonated with me, Elaine Brown's story navigating through the Black Panther Party, which is extremely misogynist and did a lot, honestly, to really abuse her. And she ended up fleeing for her life, towards the end of it. And yeah, I guess I just wanted to chime in just with, some of the lessons that I've drawn from that. And I think just also like reading about Huey Newton and how the Black Panther Party eventually disintegrated. And I know there was a large part of that due to government involvement, due to COINTELPRO and infiltration
Sure.
from the government that was encouraging a lot of those destructive tendencies. And yeah, mostly just wanted to chime in with that. And also, yeah, just generally, I think when it comes to revolutionary theory, I'm all for it. But I've never been ashamed of admitting that I am scared. I am a fearful person. I have been rock climbing for 4 years, and something that I still struggle with is the fear of falling. I still overgrip the shit out of my handholds because I just cannot get over the risk of injury, the fear of falling. And something I always worry about in revolutionary theory is, putting people at unnecessary risk. And so I just really appreciated your response there with, not fetishizing violence, but also recognizing the need to take up arms when it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and I'm remembering. So we met at an event in San Jose.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yes. So good to see you again over the screen. So this is a reminder that we did a whole weekend called Panther Power, where we actually went into the positive and negative lessons from the Panthers and that misogyny and being too quick to reach for the peace for some of those for some of the Panthers. So I will try to make sure that everybody gets access to those recordings here because we did a deep dive on the Panthers. Now I want to use this as an opportunity to just really talk a bit about the political moment that we're in and how to move effectively in it. The preference for me personally, and from the standpoint of the Islamic tradition in which I've been embedded my whole life, is that you always prefer a peaceful revolution to an armed revolution, always, because the human cost is so much smaller. A velvet revolution beats a bloody revolution every single time. That cannot be paired with a kind of systematic demonization of armed resistance. And so that's the line that I want to make clear. But for our organizing purposes, we are organizing for a political revolution. That's what my electoral political campaigns are about, and that's why they combine mutual aid, direct action, and electoral politics. When Malcolm was asked about his political philosophy, he said, "I'm a Muslim and a revolutionary." Ask me that question and you'll get the same answer, right? But the point is that we want that revolution, if possible, to happen through peaceful means because we believe in the sanctity of the life of every single human being, and we don't want needless harm to come to any human being under any circumstances. So we organize to try to achieve power that will allow us to contest that violence. That's why I said that it's going to respond to our power, and we can assert our power in a wide variety of ways. On that point, Fred Hampton, when he was asked about Weather Underground and SDS, who were like essentially accelerationists, they wanted to have what were glossed as terrorist attacks. He said, he was asked in an interview, where do you stand with respect to the weathermen? He said, we stand way back. He said, we stand way back. He said, because we believe that it is, reactionary. We believe that it is customistic. We believe that they are people, that they're running people into harm's way. And he said, and that's not revolutionary. Like revolutionaries have too much love for the people that are in their care, that they're going to send them into harm's way needlessly. So I think that I'm always going to be towing that line, which is that we are not going to make a fetish of armed revolution because there's nothing glorious about violence. Resistance is a moral responsibility, not something that we glorify because we like to shoot guns or anything of that nature. It's just that's not the case. And that was part of what I was trying to allude to and when I laid out the terms at the beginning on the distinction between revolution and liberation. What we want is the liberation, and if we can get there with a peaceful revolution, all the better. And may God make it so, because I don't. Lord knows we've seen enough people bleed out and die, over these last 5 centuries of white supremacist imperialism. We don't need no more. And if we seize power, if we seize power, we're going to show them how it's done. I've got, oh man, so many more hands, and I'm looking at the time. Okay, I got to be much more expedient in the way that I handle questions if we're going to get to the last little bit of content before we go. Yeah, is it Shok? Is that correct, or am I messing that up? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Dr. Ware. I'm grateful to be here and joining you from the Coast Salish territories from Vancouver. My first time here. So I was just reflecting about what you shared earlier about Frantz Fanon having a different context than ours right now. So I'm just curious if you can offer some thoughts around how can we organize from an organizing and mobilizing perspective? How can we organize under capitalism, when we're barely fighting for meeting our basic needs on a daily basis, you know, like going to direct actions, boycotts, divestments. As a labor organizer here in Vancouver, I found it very hard even organizing my own co-workers, you know, when we're fighting for a collective agreement. It's within a liberal context, you know, people are even afraid of using the word exploitation. I haven't even heard it from my own union. So how can we organize around that? I'm not sure if Fanon even maybe touched upon that a little bit. I'm still reading the book, so I'm just curious around that.
It's I'll table the second part of the conversation because it will come in directly tomorrow. The passages on we already have the slides for them. It's basically on the national bourgeoisie. So what you're identifying is something that is deeply rooted in liberalism, and it absolutely was a problem in Fanon's context. And most of the neo-colonial structures that have emerged in post-colonial Africa are precisely because of that liberal bourgeois elite that have become essentially stewards and caretakers of a neo-colonial state. And the way that I'll just make this connect more directly, and this will allow me to cover something that was in my notes that I wanted to cover. Fanon is writing under the context of colonial society, which has two basic modalities in Africa. So settler colonies like Algeria or Palestine operate under a logic of what's called direct rule. And ironically, the best book on this is written by Zoran's dad. So Mahmoud Mamdani, his book Citizen and Subject is the best book on understanding the logic of colonial rule on the African continent. And it's the reason why, even though Zoran is showing really, really dangerous signs of becoming AOC Pelosi and selling out, like I know he was taught right, and I'm just praying for the brother. You know, like I'm not gonna, I'm just praying for him. So but the distinction I want to make here is between settler colonies that operate they always create apartheid states, and they always exercise this form of direct rule. So that's what he's encountering in Algeria. But he's also talking about the broader colonial context of much of sub-Saharan Africa, which is indirect rule. Now, indirect rule is when the colonial power rules through the indigenous elites in the community, and that caused some confusion in a conversation that we had during Black August when Fanon talks about they will organize pilgrimage to Mecca and so forth. And he was like, well, wait, isn't that a good thing? It was like, yeah, you would think so, except the colonial state is using native elites and instrumentalizing Islam to become part of its apparatus for rule inside these places. So they're co-opting indigenous institutions and making them an arm of the colonial state. And as soon as I said that, I realized, bro, there has never been a better analogy for the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party is essentially indirect rule of colored populations in the United States. It is that, and that's what those Black imperialists and Latino imperialists and Asian imperialists, that's the structural role that they serve. The African colonial state works exactly the same way. It's just in the British system, they called them native authorities, right? And in the French system, they just called them chiefs, African chiefs. Well, they're the African chiefs. They rule on behalf of the colonial authority, and they are the thing that allows the colonial authority to be invisible. The colonial authority is invisible because it's engaged through elites that look like you and talk like you and come from your community and speak in your language and culture. And they're dressed up to look like traditional authorities, but they are an arm of the most dangerous and extractive entities that have ever existed in human history. If there's a better analogy for the Democrats, I don't know what it is. So when you use this approach of reading the class struggle and racial struggle inside the United States through the lens of a Fanon type anti-colonial analysis, then you perceive a bunch of colonial dynamics, right? And Huey did this. Like, one of the reasons why I love reading Fanon is because Huey said Fanon and Malcolm were the biggest influences on us, right? And why? So Huey would say things like the police in our community occupy our community the way that troops occupy foreign territory. They can't possibly be there to protect our property because we own no property, right? And so he immediately says, just like the Vietnamese are under occupation, so are we under occupation. And when you use the deductive reasoning that Fanon draws out of the African colonial world and apply it to our American context, you realize we are this internal colony. And that internal colony, especially in this late stage capitalism, has now even the white working class, under its thumb in ways that were previously impossible. Fernando. I'm gonna try that again. Just hit the unmute button.
Thank you, Dr. Bach. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you just fine.
So first of all, thank you for sharing your analysis and wisdom. And so my question is regarding, how Fanon talk about alienated intellectuals, and I live that in academia. I'm from Mexico, and I came to the US to do my PhD, political science, UC Riverside. Worst department ever. And so
I don't know, man. I've been in some pretty bad departments, but go ahead.
well,
Yeah.
in my experience, my own experience, right? But like,
Oh.
so my question to you, you also come from academia. Like, since I didn't get any revolutionary decolonial radical like discussions or authors or classmates whatsoever, I had to create my own space, the Decolonial Praxis Collective. And so I tried to use the platform that academia gives to like really do some decolonial praxis, but it's sometimes I think like it's really a contradiction. Like I'm trying to get a position, and a lot of it is like who you're friends with. And so I just wanted to make sense of what is your opinion on how, like, in academia, can we really do something like from academia or using academia to like advance liberation? And related to that, if you like to give like an online talk with the Decolonial Praxis Collective, we will love that. Just
Of course,
letting you
I'm at
know
your I'm
that.
at your service. So and actually, I'll also provide a link. A couple years back, I did a weekend seminar called Decolonizing Academia, and I bet you would be interested in that. So I'll answer your kind of existential question first. So these academic institute, I mean, I'm filming from my office today. So, like I'm at my office on campus. My wife thinks it has the best like aesthetics, and I think she's right. Like she decorated it. I could never. Um, you know, um, but if you inhabit these institutions, and you understand the role that they play in the political economy of imperialism, then it produces a binding moral obligation upon you that if you cash the checks that these people write to you, then you must subvert their institutions and utilize them as spaces for organizing resistance. I told my students in my 300 student undergraduate class, I said that if you are a student at a North American university, you are essentially a trainee on the Death Star. Behave accordingly. The United States is, an instrument that points beams and blows up whole worlds. But somebody got to get the plans to the rebels on how to blow up the Death Star, right? That everybody has a role to play. So if we are inside these institutions, then and this leads on to a broader conversation that we had, by the way, in the spiritual intensives for 5 years. This is important. Whatever structural position you inhabit in these systems of power, it is your moral obligation to maximally leverage those positions in the effort of liberation. So, as a tenured professor, no matter how much they want to, they cannot fire my black ass. Like it's going to be really, really hard for them to do it. Like, and don't get me wrong, they want to. Like, they never put a single post on UCSB's website when one of their faculty members was running for vice president of the United States. they wouldn't give me, flyers for an event that I held on campus. They won't do promotion for it. You say my name in some of these corners, you might as well be saying Candyman, right? Um, but all of that is to say is that it's my moral responsibility, because I know I have that protection of tenure, to push as far as possible, right? So maximally leverage whatever institutional positions you have. And we're here talking about Fanon. There does come a moment, or there may come a moment, where it is no longer tenable or feasible for you to continue to occupy that position, and you are going to have to leave that psychiatric practice and go join the revolution like Fanon did. And the problem when people make a fetish of revolution is that it takes away the complexity and the contingency that is involved in making those decisions. This is also what happens when you take a cookie cutter approach to the past rather than the knowledge and wisdom approach to the past. The knowledge and wisdom approach to the past gives you the criterion to evaluate where you are in the moment, but the moment that you're encountering has never been encountered before. And you are going to have to take the moral responsibility for how to leverage your own particular positionality in your community, in your workplace, with your online presence, how you might use your platform. All of those things are ultimately like moral questions. And there are principles, but there are no cookie cutter answers. If you find that you've reached a point where the most important organizing work that you're doing is so inhibited by that academic position, then you might have to step aside. As for me, I'm gonna keep writing on cashing these checks because I can, because the fact that I'm able, no, seriously, because the fact that I'm able to direct, like, so the first grant that I got when I was 30 was, we got, in the end, it ended up being about $1.5 million from the Ford Foundation and Mellon Foundation. And what we did with that was we took all of that money and used it to support graduate students, traditionally trained researchers all throughout Africa. We spent that money on indigenous scholars on 4 continents, right? And so we channeled the resources of the academy into the work. You have your great center. The one that I do here is the Institute for the Study of Race, Religion, and Revolution, and that has allowed me to bring in Sekou Odinga before he passed away. Who served 33 years for busting Assata Shakur out of federal prison. It allowed me to pay him a $2,500 honorarium for a 30-minute talk, right? And to put him up in a hotel and to hear his stories. And then I found out he passed away 6-8 months later. So yes, there are ways that we can use these spaces to help do the work. But if we think that the work is comprehensive in these spaces, then we're lying to ourselves for comfort's sake. Last question, Angela, and then I'll just go into a closing setup that'll get us into tomorrow. You'll recall that I started 11 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to try to wrap this at 1:11 for a clean 2 hours, if at all possible. Go ahead, Angela.
Okay, thanks. I'll make this quick. First point is developing a spiritual practice will help guide us navigate the violence, using it as a last resort and as resistance.
Beautiful.
And actually, that's what I kind of wanted to talk about. I was thinking about how while religion can be an opiate for the masses, the Enlightenment turned religion into something anti-intellectual, primitive. I'm saying this as someone who doesn't have a religion and actually would like to develop a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And instead of morality, we learn ethics, a discipline that focuses on the mind and cuts us off from our heart. And then the ethics of certain issues and entire systems becomes debatable. So, I mean, obviously there's going to be disagreements, but certain things like prisons, colonialism, genocide should be understood as sins. So
Yes.
through the limited lens of ethics, we're more likely to accept certain premises. Like prisons are okay, but mass incarceration is bad. Killing a civilian population and resistance fighters are also civilians, not combatants. The oppressor sets the terms of violence while the oppressor condemned to it. That's fine, but let's think about proportionality. So anyway, just to end, I just want to be clear. I'm using ethics as shorthand for devoid of spirituality, matters of the heart and psyche soul. Thanks.
Teach. So I mean, I don't have anything to say except, like, when can I take your class? Because that was a very comprehensive intervention. I'll just put 2 things into the conversation, and actually I'll put this as a question onto you, because This has been very, very like a difficult transition for me in a bunch of ways. People that have been with me in those community spiritual intensives know that that's actually where my heart is, right? Like those of you that have been in that space know that the spirituality component is the part that makes me do everything that I do. And to really like, working through that with people is like hugely important to me. So I have been thinking about doing another one of the spiritual intensives that's rooted in the West African Sufi tradition, at some point, in the next, couple of months, and would love to do that. Um, in large part, just because like it's needed for myself and for others who may be already in the tradition or just need resources from our human tradition on how to navigate where we are spiritually. So that's something, that if you guys are interested in it, I can do that with the 501c3, completely separate from the campaign, and then we can just do the spiritual work and have the spiritual conversation. But I'll offer this one, particular bridge. Most of the most important organizing principles, um, let me take that back. Most of the most important principles that allow the organizing to be sustainable and effective have come from being thoroughly immersed in the West African Sufi tradition for 30 years. So when I'm talking about, protests, I'm thinking about Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, the late 18th, early 19th century West African Sufi leader who led an uprising against the Atlantic slave trade, a successful revolution that leads to the creation of the largest state in 19th century Africa. And what he said is he talked about this distinction around anger. He said that everybody knows that excessive anger is blameworthy. He said, but insufficient anger is also blameworthy. He said, insufficient anger causes you to sit idly by when people are oppressed and when their rights are taken. And so he sketched out all the dangers of excessive anger. It ruins your judgment. It causes you, to think, poorly. You get carried away into emotional excess. And so what that became over years of me teaching about it in this space is cultivate a distinction inside your own heart between rage and outrage, that the moral outrage should be propelling you forward at a steady pace and fueling your resolve to fight against oppressive systems so that you never become passive and hard-hearted and simply witness oppression without it triggering some kind of angry response. But what you see over and over again is rage, which becomes blind anger, which becomes violence rather than resistance, which becomes venting your anger and your frustration in momentary catharsis through a protest rather than expressing it through disciplined organization, which is not as glorious or emotionally satisfying as being out there shouting with a sign, but which in the end is going to be more productive of the outcome that we are shooting for, correct? So being rooted in those traditions that are about, because it's not just about spirituality, it's about the training of the self. The word for psyche, for soul in the Arabic tradition and the Islamic tradition is nafs. And the nafs is not just your soul, but it is also yourself. That it is about the cultivation of a whole healed self. Because as you might have heard me say before, the instrument that we will use to negotiate liberation is the whole of ourself. And so, therefore, we need to be attending to our heart, to our spirit, to our soul, to our body in order to become effective instruments of liberation. That's actually what the psychology of liberation is all about. The psychology of liberation is how, not just about how we diagnose what colonialism is or what colonialism has done to us, but it's about how we become the most healed and efficacious versions of ourselves so that we become the instrument. Way back in the day when Imam Fode Drame and I were on a speaking tour together, somebody asked us a question and I kind of looked at him and he basically nodded, which was like his sign, yeah, go ahead and answer this one. And the question was like, with all of the issues that we face, and this was like a 95% Black audience, mix of African and African American. with all of the problems we face, how are we ever going to get free? And what I said was, well, you can't get there from where you are. And people looked at me like, that's like, why would you say that? Like, that's really mean. But what I meant is that each one of us is going to have to do the work of 100 people. And you can't even do the work of one because you can't get your own ego out of the way. See, the nafs is not just the self and the soul, it's also the ego. And unless you are engaged in disciplined practices to sublimate your ego is going to compromise your liberation efforts. The prayer that I said every night after Dr. Jill invited me to run as vice president was, I said, "Oh Allah, spare me the humiliation of having my ego stand between the people and liberation." That in the end, the sciences of holding ourselves accountable for the excesses of our ego, for the trauma that others have written on us, or the trauma that we've written on our own selves, because let's be real about that. Many of us have invited the trauma into our life time and time again. Sometimes that trauma was a particular person that had a name, and we invited that person into our life over and over again, even though that they had harmed us. Some of y'all people know exactly what I'm talking about, and others, maybe one day will learn. But all of that is just to say that there is a dialectic relationship between this inner struggle and the external struggle. That's what I got when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, is I saw a man who had been granted victory over all of his internal oppressors and his external oppressors. And he was granted that victory over his external oppressors. He became such a threat to them because of his victory over his internal demons. And so for me, those things are connected. That's what the psychology of liberation is about. We'll close with this. Césaire was one, Aimé Césaire, another great Caribbean intellectual, was one of Frantz Fanon's friends and greatest inspirations. When you are reading the passages on concerning violence, and I hope that these will get to some of Art's questions as well, when we come in tomorrow. I want you to be attentive to the fact that it was Aimé Césaire that first utilized the term imperial boomerang. So Césaire was the first person to say that fascism is when Europeans do to one another what they've done to the colonized world. And this is deeply rooted in Fanon's thinking as well. It's one thing to utilize the tools of anti-colonial or decolonial analysis. It's another thing to understand the interrelationship between imperialism abroad and fascism at home. In our current moment and opportunity for organizing, the Palestinian liberation movement, the rise of the police state, and the fortification of ICE by successive Democrat and Republican regimes is dramatizing this in very, very clear ways for the generation that surrounds us. And it is presenting an incredible opportunity for us to bring together that empire abroad and fascism at home. What I want us to do with the time tomorrow, as much as possible, is after taking a deep dive into understanding how we can use some basic tools from our various traditions to kind of deprogram much of our colonial habits of mind, is I want it to become that practical organizing session. That's why we're doing this as part of the campaign rather than just as a class, is because I want you guys to help me be of maximal service in helping bring the people's energies together in this moment. And I want this class and this series, this Roots of Revolution, to be a place where we're, yes, getting grounded in the roots of a sound analysis and understanding, but most importantly, like Fanon, we're not just happy with theory. that it's not enough for us to write books about it, that we have to now get out there and take this into revolutionary action. I have a number of ideas on how we can do that from a political organizing standpoint. But the first half of tomorrow's meeting is going to be focused on kind of those, healing from those psychological traumas. The second half is going to be a build. And it is going to be that conversation where if we've got we had 100 30 people on this call, 400 registered. How do we get to 1,000 for the next one of these calls and 300 people in the room? How do we provide the tools so that you guys have the issues based messaging that you can take out into various communities? How do we develop the narrative resources, the human resources that are going to allow everybody in this room to go out and recruit more soldiers into this fight? Because we're going to need soldiers. I appreciate Art's point. It's not about violence. It's about power. And we'll close it on Fred Hampton. That was the thing, is that what they're really afraid of is that they're afraid of the power of the people. When the people have said that there is enough, we won't need no guns. When the people have said there's enough, we won't need no guns. Oh, they overthrew the regime in Bangladesh because the students would not go back. The students were like, "That's it. We're through with this. You have to go," and they know it. Biden knew it. That's why they sent all of those troops to those encampments, because those encampments were the end. Like those encampments would have ended with Joe Biden resigning from office. And they knew that because it was organized, sustained resistance. It wasn't mobilization around an issue. It wasn't temporary or ephemeral. It was building a new kind of revolutionary solidarity through practice. That's what we're going to do in this space, inshallah. So back here tomorrow, everybody get that homework assignment done. I will look for the Fanon film to see if we can find a subtitled version of it. And I look forward, Lord willing, the creek don't rise, like they used to say, to seeing y'all tomorrow. And salam alaikum to all the people that are receiving salams.